Good evening, everyone. I'm here with Keshava, and we're going to continue with our wonderful adventure through this book, Divine Friendship by Swami Kriyananda. And we're going to start with a prayer, a chant, a couple of chants, a few minutes of meditation, and then we'll be ready to start talking. So let's pray together. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dear friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to all of you. Help us to feel your consciousness, your inspiration, your wisdom, your guiding presence. Lift us above the mundane reality of this world, that we may feel the joy of our deep, deep, everlasting connection to the Infinite Spirit. We are your children. Guide us and bless us and bring us home to thee. Om. Peace. Amen.
I have made thee pole star of my life. I have made thee pole star of my life. Though my sea is dark and my stars are gone, though my sea is dark and my stars are gone, still I see the path through thy mercy. Still I see the path through thy mercy. I have made thee pole star of my life. I have made thee pole star of my life. Though my sea is dark and my stars are gone, though my sea is dark and my stars are gone, still I see the path through thy mercy. Still I see the path through thy mercy. I have made thee pole star of my life. I have made thee pole star of my life. Though my sea is dark and my stars are gone, though my sea is dark and my stars are gone, still I see the path through thy mercy. Still I see the path through thy mercy. I have made thee pole star of my life. I have made thee pole star of my life. Though my sea is dark and my stars are gone, though my sea is dark and my stars are gone, still I see the path through thy mercy. Still I see the path through thy mercy. I have made thee pole star of my life. I have made thee pole star of my life. Though my sea is dark and my stars are gone, though my sea is dark
Okay. So, we are in the section of the book called Insights and Commentary, which basically means it's a nice miscellaneous section of everything that was good that didn't fit somewhere else, I think is what it is. So, in October of 1998, Swami writes a letter about the Indian pilgrimage for American devotees. We were starting in 1986. I and 3 others started taking pilgrimage groups to India every year or sometimes every 2 years. And it was almost entirely Americans. And for almost all of us, all of them and us, it was the first time they'd ever been to India. So it was a really big change for the energy of Ananda. We did it for about 20 years. By that point, Swami Kriyananda himself had moved to India, as had a number of others. And the responsibility for the pilgrimage shifted to people who were living there. So Swami says, I think going on the India pilgrimage was a good thing for you, even though you feel drawn more particularly to Master's ray expressed through Ananda in America. So somebody went to India and came back and said, you know, India doesn't really appeal to me. Am I really okay on this path? A lot of us had a lot to learn there. It's rather like Michelangelo, who felt he had to study anatomy in order really to get his designs of the human body right. India is our background. It helps to ground us in certain aspects of our teachings that we might not get fully were our exposure to them only from the American end. Love, Swamiji. I think he was really reassuring someone who didn't feel at all in tune with India and wanted to make sure that that they belonged, and also talking about whether it was good or bad to go to India for us. Let me see what he says here. It was an interesting experience for me. The first time I went to India was when I led the trip in 1986. Of the 3 leaders, of the 4 leaders, only one of us had ever been to India before, but we were very skilled at leading groups and we knew how to work together. But it was a very interesting experience for me to see Master's teaching from the Indian side. Because, let me think how to say it. Oh, yes. Because I had the impression that what we were doing was Hinduism. I mean, I hadn't really thought it through. I just sort of thought, you know, that what we were doing was an Indian teaching. And when I actually went to India and saw, you know, what that culture was, we were there for 28 days, actually. It was a long trip. I appreciated, and this is the way I would explain it, that Master's teaching has about as much resemblance to Hinduism as it does to Catholicism. And if you know our teachings at all, you know we're not very Catholic. But we do love Jesus, and there's devotion, and you can see the tradition of the traditional church from India, from the Catholicism, and then when you go to India and you see Hinduism, you can see that the relationship is about the same, which is not very much, because Master did not come to do what had already been done before. When he was asked by Swamiji if this was a new religion, Master said, no, but it's a new expression. So what you could see is what the roots were, but you realize that Master had just created it in a completely different way. I'm going to have to stop for a second and have to make a suggestion here. Ekavir, would you put that red sign on the door? Because if somebody comes in, they'll bump into the camera. We've made a new arrangement, which those of you who are watching can see. And the camera is in a position now where the front door, it's a little bit vulnerable to the front door. But Ekavir hadn't been here since we changed it. And while I've interrupted everything to talk about your invisible presence, if you wish to shift the table or the computer so you're not so hidden, if your view is fine, it's fine, but you can move a little if you like. Okay, now we'll go on. If it wasn't for the people who helped me, none of this would happen. Ekavir's been a good friend, and he's been now taking care of Tuesdays. Now let's go on. Now we're talking about India, and this is a letter back from 1975. The particular genius of India, Swami says. One of India's greatest contributions to the world has been its emphasis on non-sectarian, universal spiritual values. By spiritual values, I refer less to religious teachings than to those universal principles which even atheists manifest, principles of truthfulness, goodwill, and the like, which have always been uplifting forces in human nature. It's a very important distinction that we always make. Religion is the dogma and the articulated beliefs and maybe the rituals, the rules you have to follow, the things you have to say, I believe. Spirituality is your concept of life and how you live in relation to a higher reality, what values move you in life, what ethics. And spirituality is the real definition. What you say you believe is less important than how you actually live your life. Many atheists are really more spiritual in a very real sense than some churchgoers who use their religion as a way to separate them from life rather than to expand their compassion and their involvement. Swami goes on to say, many teachers have come from India teaching, perhaps unfortunately, sectarian religion. But it is not for sectarianism that India is admired and even revered by refined people the world over. Sectarianism is rife in all countries. Master used to say, ignorance is 50-50 East and West, is what he would say. There was no romantic view here of India, but a real appreciation for the reality of the particular genius, which Swami says, the particular genius of India has been rather her universal outlook, the all-embracing quality of her culture, and her philosophy of life. You know, all countries these days are being corrupted by sectarianism, religious bigotry, power-grabbing greed by small groups of individuals. But the Indian culture, per se, just holds this understanding of the nature and purpose of life that is unique as a culture. It's very interesting when we would travel over there. Everything is kind of mixed up right now, is the only way I can say it. The divine forces are stirring the pot in enormous ways. And when we would travel in India, there was a lot of just ordinary people like you would meet anywhere. But then you would meet this nobility, this expansiveness of consciousness, this depth of understanding among certain Indians that, to my experience, which is not extensive but is more than some, that you just don't see in other countries. There's just, when the highest octave of the Indian culture is extraordinary, is the only way I can put it. And I've been fortunate to meet many extraordinary Indians. There's just something about the elevation of that culture, the ancient wisdom of it, that when a soul is born there who is really in tune with it, it's exquisite. Now, of course, the true exponents of Sanatana Dharma, which is the understanding of India, are from all cultures. Like Swamiji was the most refined example of that I could ever meet. But still, there's something cultural about the Indians. Swami mentioned he was in the hospital in New Delhi at one point, more than once. When he went to live there, it was the end of his life, and he had many adventures with the medical system. And he was in this wonderful hospital there. And he commented afterwards, he said he had never anywhere in his life seen such a collection of noble souls as he saw, he said, among the doctors, the Indian doctors who worked in that hospital and treated him. He said, every one of them, he said, they just had this dignity and this uplifted quality to their character. And I, from my experience, I know exactly what he was speaking of. But here we are, we're Americans, we're doing what we do. But what's happening now, Swami has commented on many times, is that and you know, the souls with a primarily Western orientation are being born in India, and souls with a primarily Eastern orientation are being born in America, because it's time for the world to become one reality, a global culture. One of the characteristics of a higher age on the planet is that there's a global culture, which is what we see happening now. It's just that a lot of the less elevated qualities of global culture are being exported everywhere. But what's happening is that we are becoming one world, because in higher ages, communication and travel make that possible, and human beings are the same everywhere. Just the differences are quite small compared to the samenesses. So that's what we see happening. Now, this is about an article that someone submitted to Swami that was written on yoga and meditation, and this was in July of 1990. Swami starts by saying, "You've written a really excellent article. Congratulations. I don't know who this was from, and I don't know what this was for. Maybe it'll come to me. Here are a few changes I suggest if you're agreeable to them. Mostly they are corrections of fact or more careful statements of thoughts of mine that you've quoted. In one or two places I've suggested rewordings for you, which seem to me more accurate, but of course I don't want to presume or insist." So Swami gives lots of feedback, but leaves it to the author. "I have a comment to make on George Feuerstein's comments to you," page 10. He was a scholar about yoga. He studied yoga in an academic way, if I have that correctly. He might not have been academic, but he was an authority on East and West. Yogananda was a master of yoga, which is a field in which the experts have always insisted on the importance of direct inner experience over intellectual scholarship. He said that his mission was, in part, to bring back the original yoga of Krishna. This is what I was referring to about India. Master Maid described his mission as to bring back, to clarify, and to resurrect, in a sense, the original teachings of Krishna and the original teachings of Jesus, and to show that they are the same. It's because over centuries and centuries, as Swamiji said, the tree of Krishna's teaching is now in need of pruning. And it hasn't been institutionalized the way the teachings of Jesus have been, but both have been profoundly and not so positively affected by the passage of time. So anyway, he's quoting, he said, his mission was in part to bring back the original yoga of Krishna. It seems as if his authority in this field vastly exceeds that of Feuerstein. And I don't in any way mean to denigrate Feuerstein's scholarship. So he was correcting that. Kriya does mean action, but Lahiri Mahashaya gave it that name to point out that this is the true internal karma yoga, without which outward action alone, and indeed any merely outward form of yoga, is rather like a one-legged man. And that's very interesting, isn't it? Kriya means action, and Kriya is internal karma yoga. Because karma yoga is, we consider it the yoga of action, but the action can't be only external. It's a very subtle and beautiful point, isn't it? Wonderfully put. So he says any merely outward form of yoga is like a one-legged man. So if we think that we can just do karma yoga without also working internally on our consciousness, we are really not understanding what true yoga is. Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita says this body is the field of action. So therefore, that means within ourselves. Master made the interesting comment. The only place that God can be experienced is in the human nervous system. I've always loved that quote, because it brings it down to such an incredibly mundane level, the human nervous system. Sometimes there's debate as to whether or not mankind is really the highest species, because it's pointed out that mankind does a lot of evil that other species don't do. But the reason mankind is the highest species and was given dominion over the earth is because the human body is sophisticated and subtle to the point where it is possible to experience the infinite in a human body. That the human body can contain infinite perception because of the brain and because of the way the nervous system is set up, so that it is, the power is in the center of the body and at the highest point in the body. And no other creature, even though many creatures may behave in ways that are more elevated than the way some human beings speak, but the nervous system, there's no creature in creation who has a nervous system where they could actually have the experience of the divine. Only the human being has that. It's a very interesting point. So this is where he says, Krishna says, the body is the field of action. There's a second. This body is the field of action. Repeatedly, Krishna recommends going away for solitary meditation. And you can't do any karma yoga when you're all by yourself. So the karma yoga becomes the uplifting of the inner energy by direct action. Meditation is the internal yoga. Kriya yoga assists one merely on this inner path. So it's not like Kriya is an end in itself, but it's a technique that allows us to go deeper into meditation. Krishna speaks of the yogi as being greater than the jnani. Be thou a yogi, he counsels Arjuna, and not merely be thou a jnana yogi, or be thou a karma yogi. Jnana is the wisdom path, and jnana uses the power of discernment, of discrimination. The mantra of the jnana yogi, so to speak, is neti neti, which means not this, not this, not this, meaning the jnani looks deeply at all aspects of reality and rejects everything that is not the divine. The yogi, in the way that Krishna means this, is one who follows a specific course of action in order to change his consciousness. The karma yogi is the one who serves outwardly. So, he doesn't say to be a jnana yogi or a karma yogi, he just says, be thou a yogi. Apart from jnana yoga and karma yoga, bypaths, as Yogananda called them, to self-realization, because they depend on individual temperament rather than on soul perception, the Gita places great emphasis also on another form of yoga which was not mentioned by Feuerstein, bhakti yoga. Bhakti means devotion. The last chapter of the Bhagavad Gita indeed urges the devotee to reach such a high level of inner perfection that he can forsake all other spiritual practices and simply love God. So this is a very important omission on the part of Feuerstein. This is what Swami is working toward, saying that you're missing a certain point, and this scholar has missed a very important point. It wasn't Paramahansa Yogananda only, but all of our line of gurus, all of whom were like Yogananda, great masters of yoga, who said that ours is the path of Raja Yoga, not of Kriya Yoga only, but the focusing of all forms of yoga in the inner realization that comes from direct inner communion with God. Now, Swami's writing this letter to someone who knows what Swami's referring to. Raja Yoga is the combination of Jnana Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Karma Yoga, and the practice of meditation. It brings them all together. Kriya is just a specific technique to help you with your meditation. So to be accurate, this is what Swami's trying to say. To say that our path is the path of Kriya Yoga is not as accurate as to say our path is the path of Raja Yoga. I mean, this is all written for an informed audience, this article, and Swami wants to make sure that it's exactly correct. Because once you start saying ours is the path of Kriya Yoga, just to think it that way, then a specific practice begins to define our path. Whereas Kriya Yoga comes after we get onto the path of Raja Yoga. And what I'm trying to say is, when we follow the path of Raja Yoga, we are unified with the ancient traditions of India, and we are a particular a lineage on that path of Raja Yoga, but our path is Raja Yoga. And so all lineages who practice as we do, according to their own master's way of doing it, we can all stand together as practitioners of Raja Yoga. If you define our path as the path of Kriya Yoga, then you have already separated yourself from the universal of Raja Yoga. Better to say we are Raja Yogis who in our lineage practice Kriya, because if we are Kriya Yogis, then you're not a Kriya Yogi, and therefore we don't have a common language, we don't have a common foundation. So these subtleties are extremely important, because the lack of them leads to sectarianism. And this is precisely what Swami was saying. India has been so powerful in keeping a universal truth because Raja Yoga is the right definition. Kriya Yoga is too small. So, those yogas which depend on a person's individual temperament have their inner side too. At this point, they too become universal, for they lead to the development of intuition, which is the soul's power, as Yogananda called it, of knowing God. Thus, they are not different from the path of Raja Yoga, but are like contributory streams feeding into the main river of inner divine perception. So again, Swami's trying to follow exactly what he just praised India for. It is the West that, with its heritage of Aristotelian either-or logic, that tries to separate the different approaches to truth. The Indian vision, on the contrary, of life, and therefore of the spiritual path, is unitive. It took me a long time to understand this difference and to appreciate their unitive vision as more inherently valid than our own analytical and therefore separatist view of reality. And Swamiji, it's like, these are very important distinctions. And they're especially important for those of us who are living at this time and are such early generations of helping to define Master's teachings, of helping to define self-realization in the West. We can just kind of casually pick up an idea. Yes, we're Kriya Yogis, that's who we are. We follow the path of Kriya Yoga, or I'm a Karma Yogi, or I'm a Jnana Yogi, or whatever we might say, without realizing that we've already misstated the reality of what we're doing. And so Swami works very hard to get us clear-minded enough to be able to really know what we're doing. Because this is going to go on for a long time. Now, I'm pausing for a second. I actually believe that what I'm about to say was talked about at great length in one of my 9 a.m. broadcasts, but I can't really say exactly where. Oh no, it was actually in the series about money magnetism, but it was when I stopped to talk about the meaning of crystal clarity. And Swami had this line in the Money Magnetism book, which is, muddy thinking and feeling leads to chaos. In the course of the broadcast, I came to that back to that many times. Muddy thinking and feeling leads to chaos. So we get a little muddy in our thinking. Oh, Raja Yoga, Kriya Yoga, what difference does it make? Well, it's a little bit of muddy thinking, and then pretty soon we're Kriya Yogis, and our path is Kriya Yoga. And someone says, well, our path is mantra yoga, or our path is whatever it is, and all of a sudden we're separate from each other. Where if we're clearly saying, well, we follow the path of Raja Yoga, then everybody else who follows the Raja Yoga path is our brother and sister. And since such horrors are being perpetrated even as we speak in the name of religion, we definitely want to set ourselves on a different track than that. Because no true religion started that way. They all just fell into it one way or another. Swami talks about the either-or nature of Aristotelian logic. He said where you think that you're being more accurate by bringing it down to an exact reality definition that precludes all others, you think that's better. Whereas, as Swami said, it took him a while to understand the unitive point of view of the Indian, which is you make it so that it's a wide umbrella in which many aspects of the diamond can be emphasized, and you're still working with the diamond. Instead of trying to exclude, you try to include. You may wish to consider these points in your presentation of Yogananda's teachings especially. Thank you for sending us your article. I appreciate the opportunity of being, as I hope, of some help to you in this, your worthwhile contribution to the legend of Yogananda, and besides to the story of the impact of India's timeless teachings on the West. So I think this was an outsider writing an article for publication. Okay, now this is, let's see. This is something, the reason I'm saying this is a book about the book Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. Now I have learned, because I'm now of an age where I have friends, I have peers who are young enough to be my grandchildren, or I'm old enough to be their grandmother is actually probably how you put that. And I'm really appreciating how much culture has shifted and how fast. That images that were so dynamic for much of my life are literally non-existent in the lives and the thought form and the experience of many millennials. So Ayn Rand was a very well-known novelist who wrote novels that were yet designed to present a very dynamic philosophy of life, and she actually became her novels became a rallying point for certain political points of view, what you would call, I guess you would call them conservative points of view. Nowadays, I don't even know what politics is about, but it was very much about the rugged individual, the freedom of the individual, the non-interference with the business and powerful people's ability to move forward in the world. And there was a certain sort of prejudice in favor of wealth and power in the world. And her heroes were often, rugged individuals who just made it happen in their own way. And I read quite a number of her novels. They were very interesting and entertaining and quite thoughtful and intelligent, but it became a philosophy of life. And so Swamiji is talking about that, and it's a longish letter, several pages, in which he talks about the positive and the negative of what she's written. So this was written in April 1975. One of her most famous books was a book called Atlas Shrugged. I read it, but I'm a little dim on it, but I know the characters. It was about money and power. I've read Ayn Rand's book, Atlas Shrugged. Thank you for recommending it. I find corroboration of some of my own ideas in her book and help from it on certain other ideas. Swami was actually, politically speaking, Swami did not favor massive government interference in society, just as a by the way. People assume, sort of in our sector of the world, that a certain political liberalism would go with what we're doing. And individuals in Ananda cover a wide spectrum of political views. But Swami was less in favor of the government ought to do something. He was very much in favor of the government ought to step back from people's lives. Not that he ever took a political stance, but briefly he registered as a libertarian, actually, politically, just because he was in favor of as little government as possible. He felt that individuals were better off carrying out their own destiny. However, he was never really that political. But that's what comes up in this, because Ayn Rand was exceedingly political. She's not a great novelist, Swami says, nor a very profound thinker. Her characters are almost entirely either black or white. The bad are very bad, the good absolutely good by her standards, which aren't very high. I love the way Swami gets so much in just a few sentences. Well, I didn't read her critically, and I enjoyed her novels. Maybe she's not a great novelist, but they were entertaining. The bad are very bad, the good absolutely good by her standards, which aren't very high. So we've set the tone here. She hasn't understood her own philosophy clearly enough. For while it is true that self-fulfillment is the underlying motive for all true creativity, and true also that the looter consciousness of uncreative people often masquerades as selfless dedication to the welfare of others, while in fact draining them of whatever power they may have. Now see, here's the point. So, people are, the looter consciousness, okay, she's suspicious of altruism because she feels that often altruistic people have some psychological motive that is less noble than what they appear to be putting forth. And Swami's feeling about, Swami always had a strong feeling that too much charity was not helpful to people. By no means was he unsympathetic or uncompassionate, so don't misunderstand. But Swami understood that the purpose of life is to develop inner strength. And you need to help people develop inner strength. You don't just need to protect them from their problems. I was struck, and this is related to this, a friend of mine, her son was in the Peace Corps recently, contemporarily. He was in the Peace Corps, and he was for 5 years, and he was in some impoverished part of Africa. And he lived in some little village and became just part of village life, learned the language, lived with the people. And he was helping them, helping the women to develop some handicrafts with sewing and a few other things. And some Ananda people became involved because we all knew the man and were inspired by his dedication. And of course, a little bit of money in that context could make a huge difference. But he had learned that too much money, and that it wasn't about the quantity, measured from the American side, but too much money was not helpful, because what he was trying to work with, and succeeded to a certain extent, was to help people generate their own energy and their own creativity. And he knew that if he just came in and solved the problem with American money, it would make them, he felt, just want more American money. Whereas if he worked with them with their own energy to develop initiative and to help some, but not too much. And that's sort of what Swami was talking about. You really help people by helping them learn how to be dynamic in themselves, rather than just solving the problem, which often can make them more passive. And that's what he's talking about there. Some altruistic people drain energy from the people they're trying to help because it takes away from them their initiative. Now, I'm not really going to defend that point of view, or I haven't even given it enough thought to say. I'm just explaining what the issue is here. Okay. So she misses the boat by insisting that what her main characters want is value in return for their investment. But what they themselves show by their actions is that the investment itself, the creative energy they put out, is their highest and only real reward. So she tries to say they're doing it for the money, and Swami says that the real fulfillment of doing something dynamic and creative is the energy that flows through you. And that's where real satisfaction comes. It's not because I made a lot of money. The real experience of life is when I generate and become a channel for dynamic energy. And this, of course, is forever the mark of the truly creative spirit. The person who thinks, what's in it for me, lives on a much lower plane of creativity. See, she started out with a philosophical position, which is selfishness is good. And so then she has to try to make characters that prove that, and that's why Swami said she's not really a great novelist, because she doesn't really create real people. She creates people that carry out her predetermined concept of the point she's trying to make. Whereas, great novelists, you're just in the company of a real person. Ayn Rand makes an even greater mistake in equating sincere desire to help others with the looter consciousness of uncreative people. She's perfectly correct in the point she makes that uncreative people have no real desire to help others in spite of their protestations to the contrary, protestations by which they try to win the good opinion of others, to offset the low opinion they secretly hold of themselves. She's also quite right in saying that no good end is served by helping weak people in their weakness. So that was what I was trying to say before. There's this other issue of creative versus uncreative, but I'm going to just let it pass. But she's wrong in thinking that charity can rise no higher than welfare handouts. This is where her thinking is shallow. That's why I said she's a shallow thinker. But she's even more wrong in not realizing that by generously helping one another, without the thought of what's in it for me, we serve ourselves in the highest way of all, for we expand our happiness to include that of others. So what's happening with her writing is that she's limited by her own state of consciousness. At the end of his life, it may have been the last book Swami wrote, was Love Perfected, Life Divine. And it's a novel, and it's a rewrite of a novel that was published 100 years earlier, when that book was called Life Everlasting, and it was written by Marie Corelli. Marie Corelli was a very, very successful novelist 100 years ago, and she wrote books on spiritual themes. She really did her very best to write about, in an uplifting way, about spiritual ideas. And her books are really quite lovely. I've read a number of them, and they're well worth reading. They're flawed. They're not great novels, which is why they've been forgotten mostly. But at least she was in there trying. And Life Everlasting is the story of soulmates. She approaches the question of the eternal other, the eternal partnership, which Master actually said does exist, but not not as a passionate romance. The level of soulmate that Master speaks of, by its very definition, let me put it differently. must eventually reach the point where it totally transcends all physical passion, because physical passion is a lesser state of consciousness than divine realization. A master only ever spoke about the concept of soulmates once, because he knew that if he talked about it too much, everyone would forget about God and just go looking for their soulmate. And what he primarily did is he simply acknowledged that it exists. The concept exists. And he said, before you attain final liberation, you must have union with your soulmate. But he said your soulmate could be on another planet. And there's no end. The whole passionate romance aspect of it does not play into what Master was saying, although it's inevitable that in some incarnation, in many incarnations, it would play out in that way. So the life everlasting is the story of soulmates, but in the most romantic sense. However, it's also, a great deal of it is true. It's very interesting. A great deal of it is true to the teachings as we understand them. And the basic story is there's the man and the woman, and they have countless incarnations together, and always something blows them apart. They kill each other, they betray each other, and every once in a while they kind of get it together, but usually it's just a mess. And finally, he realizes that he must develop his own consciousness before he's going to be capable of having the kind of love that he really wants to have. So he drops out of the relationship for a number of incarnations and goes off and essentially becomes enlightened. Then he finds her again. She's also progressed spiritually, but what they want to have with each other is not going to be possible till she does what he did and develops her consciousness. So in the story, she goes off, she does that, they come together, and then for the rest of eternity, they sail around on this yacht together, which Swami says does not really sound to him like like heaven. But that's how the picture is done. So Swami rewrote the book, and he took her plot, he took some of her story, her character, no, he took a lot of her story and the plot, but he elevated the understanding, because Marie Corelli was reaching for a lot of ideas, but she herself did not have the benefit of having a God-realized guru. She didn't have the benefit of really understanding her subject, so she could only express it to the limit of her own understanding of reality. So Ayn Rand, in exactly the same way, she could only express what she wanted. She had this feeling about fulfillment and creativity and selflessness and this, but she was simply limited by her own view of life. She just didn't have a higher view than that. And when you don't have a higher view, you often can't imagine a higher view than that. Swamiji said in his own life, he said he didn't have selfish motive. He just didn't have selfish motive. So when people would try to figure out what his selfish motive was, and even when we were in this litigation for a while, people kept trying to uncover his nefarious ways, his financial abuse and various things like that. And as Swami said, they couldn't imagine that he wasn't taking advantage of his position, because it was unthinkable to the people who were after him that if a person had the opportunity, they wouldn't take it. And they just literally could not conceive of a person that wouldn't. And that's just the way it is. You can't see it above what you can see. So anyway, let's see. This type of fulfillment is the only true motive for serving others. And Swami was saying that we expand our own happiness by thinking about the happiness of others. When it is not one's motive, service becomes not a free offering to them, but an insensitive imposition on their free will. But in equating humanitarian love, and worse still, spiritual love, with uncreative something-for-nothing attitudes is Ayn Rand's greatest mistake. If you're giving without, well, actually, I haven't read the book, so I can't say for sure. Let's see what she would say. She thinks you're trying to get something. She thinks everybody's trying to get something. So if you look like you're not trying to get something, you must still be trying to get something. So she makes up an explanation. Because she can't imagine that you would give merely for the joy of giving. She just can't see it. This error makes it possible for her book to do much harm as well as much good. You know, this is very popular, and she was one of these early proponents of this, which is, you know, there's no such thing as unselfishness. Everybody fundamentally is selfish. And if they appear to be selfish, it's just because you don't understand how they're selfish. And that's why he says she can do much harm with this book. For there are many people who, seeing the evil that is communism, and she does a magnificent job of tearing to shred its tangles of lies. She was very strongly against communism, very strongly. The book of hers that I really remember the most, that was very powerful, that's still very powerful in my mind, and I have no idea what the name of it is. I'm not sure. I've known the name of it for decades. But it was the story of people who were living in Russia when the Bolshevik Revolution happened, and gradually sort of what that world became, or shortly after. But it was a real, and I believe truthful, expose of the way communism was being expressed at that time. And in the end, the heroine tries to escape, but dies in the process of trying to escape. But that book was very, very vivid and very true. And that's where Swami says she does a magnificent job of tearing to shreds the lies of communism as it was, well, communism as it is. It's atheistic, it's materialistic, it has no regard for the individual. Seeing the evil that is communism, what does she say? For there are many people who, seeing the evil that is communism, imagine that the cure for communism lies entirely in the free enterprise system. There it is. That it's either communism or free enterprise. Unfortunately, not all truly creative industrialists are so Simon pure as her black and white view of things suggests. Some of the most dynamic and creative of men have been ruthless destroyers as well, driving competitors out of business by unscrupulous means simply because their guiding rule was the thought, what's in it for me? So she demonizes communism and therefore glorifies capitalism. And that's not really possible. That's where the black and white lack of deep thinking really comes from. Ayn Rand believes it is the voting power of the weak, uncreative majority that gives politicians their real strength, and that it is by this strength that legislation gets passed against the interest of big business. But in fact, it is money that gives those politicians their power, that buys their influence on crucial legislation, and that topples them again when they rebel. The people like to think they have the final say, and in theory, of course, they do have it. But in practice, it is money that makes possible the propaganda that directs most of their thinking. Oh, Swami's just really going after it. The weakness of democracy lies not only in the fact that so many people don't really know what's best for them, better that, though, than having someone equally ignorant telling them, but in the fact that they have no sure way of knowing what they're getting when they vote. Swami's comment was, democracy is not a very good system, but it's the best one we have right now, because people don't know. They don't know what's in their best interests. I mean, this is just human nature. I mean, this is early Dwapara. There's no solution here. It's just a light and shadow world. We have to do the best. That's why, for the most part, I don't pay any attention to politics. It's just impossible. I pay attention because I like to know what the world is doing, but I have no solutions. I can't get involved on that level. The supposed enemies of socialism are the rich, but an enormous body of evidence forces the all but unavoidable conclusion that it is the very rich who have financed socialism and communism from their very inception and who've been the most influential in the enactment of the socialist legislation that has become so epidemic in this country and elsewhere. And it is the free enterprise system that has made possible this great wealth. This is written in 1975, realize. So life is really different now. I am very much a supporter of free enterprise and of the least possible interference by government in the affairs of men. That was the basic position that I told you about Swami. But Ayn Rand's emphasis on the what's in it for me attitude supports those very aspects of the free enterprise system which have justified certain people in self-aggrandizement at the expense of others. She has helped to make the conservative cause what it is today, an encampment for another kind of bully, merely, for people who want to impose their philosophy on others just as much as the so-called liberals want to impose theirs. The very effort to impose in any way on the free will of others is the first step toward that kind of monopolistic thinking that has been the breeding ground for everything evil in modern socialism. So he's just kind of taken it all down from both sides, isn't he? But the answer to all of it is consciousness. That's the good news. The error, it seems to me, lies in making a virtue of self-aggrandizement, as Ayn Rand does, instead of seeing that the real moral value lies in self-fulfillment. The solution lies not in new or old systems, but in helping people to develop the right expectations of life. Such help is possible, for it is only through wrong teachings that people have come to the point of holding such wrong expectations as they do. The thought, for example, that material security is everything. So, I mean, Swami just goes right back to the fundamental. People have been taught incorrectly that the more money you have, the safer and the happier you are. And that is a fundamental wrong teaching, and you'll never be able to get a working model of a balanced and happy society as long as your very premises are corrupt. So, let's see. Books such as Ayn Rand's have a tremendous influence on people's minds and consequently on their actions. She was very influential when she was being published. The greatest war being fought in our times is in the realm of ideas. What happens outwardly is only symptomatic of this inner war. When I was writing the book Lightbearer about Swamiji, I remembered through the 70s and a little bit more into the 80s, but especially through the 70s, when Swami would instruct us in classes and give programs and lectures, he was so intense. He would speak, with this tremendous amount of energy, often very quickly, just pouring energy out when he would speak. And when I was in seclusion, really reflecting on all of this, writing this book, I thought about how many times Swami talked about the war of ideas. And I was thinking about the world view that Master has taught us. The causal world is the realm of ideas, the astral world is the realm of energy, and the ideas are a great deal of energy is focused on the ideas, and then they're manifested in the material world. Now, that's the causal, astral, material, three worlds that we talk about. But even just in our own, ordinary life, it also follows the same pattern. We have an idea about something, we apply energy to it, and then it manifests. I mean, as I'm sitting here looking at this camera, I'm also looking, we rearranged this room. For those of you who watch anything that's more than a week or two old, you'll see that we're sitting in this room differently now. It required the fact that where the camera was, where the computer is, everything. And I'd never been satisfied with the way it looked. It was always just messy and not efficient. So I had the idea that we have to reorganize this. Then I had to put energy into it. I'm going through the website, the internet, looking for different items, pieces of furniture, different power cord, things like this. I mean, I spent, a couple of days just focused. First was the idea to fix it. Then I had to put energy into it. And then, everything gets delivered. And we set it all up and we have a new system in place, which is much more harmonious with the living room and so on like that. Idea, energy, material manifestation. But of course, everything starts from the idea. If I hadn't had the idea that the way we were running it worked, but it wasn't optimal. So there was the idea had been growing. And then but I could have had the idea, but what then? So I had to put the energy out to it. I had to spend money. I had to spend time. And that's, putting that into it before there was a manifestation. So the way all of society, the way the whole material plane works, the ideas, the energy applied, and then there's a different result. So Swamiji was here as, the direct disciple of Master, commissioned to carry out, this world-changing mission that he set up. And Swamiji had to communicate to us what the fundamental ideas were. And in the 70s, and we're all in our 20s, in the 1970s, and we're all in our 20s, and we're in this isolated rural community up in Nevada County, which is now Ananda Village, with very little idea of what we were doing, except a kind of, you would just intuitive understanding of where we were and why. Swami had to explain everything to us. He just had to explain everything. I mean, this 1975 talking about Ayn Rand, I mean, people would come and they were believed in communism, or they, were believed in liberal democracy, or they were anti-big business, and just like muddy thinking leads to chaos. Swami just had to work with us to get clear the difference between Raja Yoga and Kriya Yoga, and I mean, even what is Raja Yoga, what is Bhakti Yoga, everything, to get the ideas in order, so that when we could put energy, we could put sufficient energy into the ideas that would take us where we really wanted to go. And this is where Ayn Rand put a lot of energy, and was very popular as a novelist, into her ideas. And Swamiji is saying she did some good and much harm. Because, you start telling people that the more money you have, the more powerful and the happier you'll be. When you start telling people in a very convincing way that there's no such thing as altruism, that everybody's out to get something, you start building a society with certain attitudes, which is what we have now. Exactly. It's the fruit of this. And now, we're just exposing everyone. It's not a very good time. Our ideas are confused. We don't know what we're doing. So, here he goes on. The greatest war being fought in our times lies in the realm of ideas. What happens outwardly is only symptomatic of this inner war. And so I took the digression to talk about how Swami was fighting that inner war so intently. I was, as I said, most impressed with the case Ayn Rand makes against communism and its endless self-deception and insidious corrosion of all that is honest and honorable in human nature. And of course, I was intrigued with her vision of an ideal, creative community cut off from a society bent on destroying itself with looter consciousness. Looter is the word she uses in her book. Swami always puts it in quotes when he uses it. I think it exemplified people who are out for themselves without giving. But she attributes that attitude to people who may not deserve it. My practical mind couldn't help doubting that so many dynamic minds could really live happily together in one place. He's talking about her ideal community. You're going to get all these self-made, powerful men who are used to running everything, put them all together and think they're going to get along. The failure of Brook Farm community in the last century, this is an historical fact, not about her novels, was due mainly to the fact that too many intellectuals and creative thinkers were working together to form the ideal society. But that's a quibble, Swami says. In fact, I had almost exactly the same idea for a novel of my own when I was 15. That was when I actually started planning to establish a community myself someday. I hope you won't think I'm merely putting down Ayn Rand's book. I found it a rewarding experience, and one that helped to clarify some of my own thinking, and I'm grateful to you for suggesting it. It is because it stimulated me that I felt inspired to jot down these thoughts, somewhat hastily, while the impression of the book is still fresh in my mind. And whom could I most rightly share them with but you? So that's the end of that. Oh, now here's a little more about Ayn Rand. Now this is from 1999, so we're now talking like 24 years later. Thank you for getting the book to me. And yes, I completely agree with your assessment of Ayn Rand. I've really no use for her philosophy, which I consider outrageous. So outrageous, in fact, that sometimes it's good to get a glimpse of how the opposition thinks. I did like her first book, We the Living. Oh, yes, We the Living. That's the book that I read that I really liked. That was an anti-communism book about people who really were living in that society and how it really drained the life out of them, is the only way I could say it. Same philosophy, though muted, and an excellent explanation of the corrupting influence of the false, quote, religion of communism she grew up with in Russia. Oh, that was her own background. That was it. She herself was a refugee from communist Russia. Master said that communism was a tremendous danger to the world. Now, I'm saying these things without even having... Nowadays, the whole world has gotten so mixed up. But what Master stood against and felt that communism, and he was talking in 1950, was a tremendous threat because it was entirely materialistic and absolutely denied that human nature had a higher spiritual dimension. And he felt that the war was between materialism and spirituality, and that the financial side of it was not the side of it. And because of that, Stalin could murder millions of his own people because human life had no value, had no inherent divinity to it. And that was the evil. That is the terrible evil of it. But the forces of materialism have just invaded our whole society. And, the many of the leaders that we have freely elected are just selfish. The people that we admire, are materialistic and selfish, and because the war of ideas, we've been corrupted into thinking that these are values that we should honor. So anyway, otherwise, yes, she's a lightweight philosophically, and I've never been interested in reading this book. But now I've read so many political and financial newsletters praising at least one aspect of it that I'm intrigued. As a person, Swami says about her, as a person, she must have been high energy, but insufferable. Swami was so good at just pinning it. So he would have admired her for her high energy. So be it. Well, let's see, we can read a little more. Okay, this was in 2000. This is a response to an educator who had recently learned of Ananda's Education for Life system. Now, this is This is a very long letter, so I'm only just going to be able to start. I can give you the context because I know where this came from. This was an academician, a person who was worked in the field of education, but did research and wrote research papers and worked at the university level. And they were doing an impartial survey of various theories of education and what was beneficial and what worked. And she came across, it was a woman, she came across Swami Kriyananda's Education for Life. And she was completely impartial in relation to it. And she was an authority on various educational methods. And she thought Swami's Education for Life, which is just a little book describing it, was the finest, innovative, creative educational system that she had encountered. And so she wrote to Swami just thanking him and commenting. And for Swami, it was deeply gratifying, because it's one thing when other devotees say this is good, but she was a complete outsider, and she studied, many systems, and from that perspective offered him tremendous praise and encouragement. And it was gratifying for Swami to think that he was going to be able to influence objective-minded people, that they would see the merit of what he'd done, not for his sake, but for the sake of the system being adopted, for the sake of the children. And going back to what we were looking at before, people have been wrongly educated as to what constitutes a fulfilling and a happy life. So the idea of rightly educating them is something that is very, very dear to Swamiji and to Ananda. So Swami writes, "Your letter brought me much pleasure and also some trepidation. First of all, I want to say that I am most happy to see your interest in the Education for Life concept. I wasn't aware that others have used the expression, but I am happy if, as appears from your letter, they have. I believe that concepts should not carry persons' names, as with the Montessori system. Truth is truth. No one has a right to claim it as their own." This is something that Swami believes in. It's not really the Steiner method or the Montessori method, so he called it Education for Life. It was just, he felt that was far more expressive and appropriate. Thus, from the outset, let me say that the more people like you can carry this most needed idea to others, the better. If the public schools can accept even a small part of it, that will be better than nothing. If anyone else wants to take the idea and call it his own, I really don't mind at all. Truth alone is what counts. My one concern would be that he not dilute it with ideas that defeat the basic concept. In other words, undermine it. The education needs I see today are: 1, modern schooling breeds atheism. Without going into all the reasons for that claim, the results are, I believe, self-evident. Children are raised without moral or spiritual values. As a result, they become cynical, angry, antisocial, and selfish. The high suicide rate among the young is due to a large extent, I think, to the fact that modern education gives them nothing to believe in. The greatest need of this age is to believe in God again. Modern education is essentially atheistic. I live in Silicon Valley. Palo Alto is a well-known city. Fortunately, the plague seems to have abated, but for a couple of years, there were a number of suicides in the local high school. It was just unbearably painful, just unbelievable. We also run an Education for Life school right here in Palo Alto also. And when the community was in a state of traumatic shock over these suicides, our educators went to an open meeting in the hope of being able to bring in something that would help. The meeting starts with the statement, there will be no discussion of religion at this meeting. The entire question of spirituality, of God, it's like, we're not going to talk about any of that. And it was just like, oh dear. I mean, partly it's because so much of religion is sectarian that it ends up just being a terrible fight instead of anything helpful. But the other is, and this is what's happened in America now, because atheism is so strong, it's like you're not allowed to talk about religion in many contexts because it's offensive to the atheists. And if it's a public context and you're talking about religion, you're violating the church and state interpretation of the Constitution, and it goes on and on and on. It's very complicated. One thing leads to another, and then there you are. But it was just heartbreaking. Because, well, Swami, in his Education for Life book, he starts by saying the problem is not spirituality. The problem is sectarianism. And if we just talk about the values that spirituality creates, we can agree on the values. And so he just tries to pick it up from a different thread. But when children are deliberately trained not to believe in anything beyond their selfish aggrandizement, which is what he was talking about, Ayn Rand, they naturally think, what's the point? And, it's fortunately, at least for the moment, the wave has stopped. Second, children need to be taught values. But if moral values are left on a level of social or personal convenience, they are not values. They are merely schemes for self-betterment. The greatest defect in modern education is the modern dogma, that's all it is, that spirituality must necessarily be considered sectarian, a matter of beliefs, and therefore not scientific and not a proper subject for education. Yep, there it is, isn't it? And there's no inner reality. When we were getting our school going here, which was now almost 30 years ago, we went around to some of the private schools in the area, and this area is rife with very high-level private schools. And we went to one of the most touted, and it's not without its virtues. And they were working on building the self-esteem of the children, because that's, sort of what people do now. And there was it was a lower school, but it was like 6th grade, 7th grade. And there was this bulletin board, and it was the self-esteem tree. And the children made little leaves and wrote something on them and pasted it on the tree. There was maybe 30 leaves on that tree, and I had the time to actually read every one of them. Of the 30 or so leaves that were on that tree, every single one of them, except one, 29 out of 30, dealt with something that, some outer achievement, outer recognition that child had. I won the winning goal, I won the spelling bee, I got an A on my chemistry test, therefore I feel good about myself. One of them said, I'm less moody than I used to be. But all of the others were about something that they had managed to acquire, to do and to acquire. But it wasn't even the satisfaction of having put out the energy, it was the thing. Which of course means if they don't have those things, then they don't have anything. And this was the theory about how you build self-esteem, which is you achieve, you accomplish, you acquire, therefore you're a good person. You see how insidious that is? I mean, first of all, this particular school, this is the joke of some of these schools. We have this high grade point average, we get all our children into these schools. Well, of course, they eliminate in kindergarten the children who don't have, high functioning academic capabilities. And then, of course, they can say that a high percentage of our children are high functioning academically capable. But then those children are taught that you're worthy because you've acquired. You've achieved, you've acquired. You've competed, you've achieved, you've acquired. And you see, those are the ideas everybody's working with. And then the children, they rebel against it. They have very good reason to rebel against it. I'm going to tell one more story before I stop. And there's quite a bit more about education for life, so you're going to hear a lot from me. I have a lot of feeling about this. There was a big scandal here. This could have been 15 years ago. Not in Palo Alto School District, but one town over. These are big Silicon Valley company towns. And the children in the high school hacked into the school's computer system and raised their grade point averages because the competition to get into the big name colleges. I mean, high school, the only purpose of high school is to build your resume and to get your grade point average so you can go to the prestigious college so that you can have that on your record, and then you can get the job and then get the money, and then you'll be happy. I mean, that's the thought form. Goes straight through. So the children hacked into the computer system because they know much more about these things than their adults do, especially 15 years ago, and changed their grades. And then they were discovered, and there was a big hoo-ha because this was a very, very prestigious high school, and I was most impressed by the response of some of the children who'd been discovered. And basically what they said, nobody ever asked me if I was learning anything. Nobody asked me if I was interested or inspired by what I was doing, least of all whether I was enjoying it. All they wanted from me was a grade. I found a more efficient way to get it. And I thought, well, you're right. You're absolutely right. You just game the system because that's all anybody ever told you. Your high school, your experience doesn't mean anything. It's only a means to an end, and even is the college, and the college is a means to the job, and the job is a means to money. So why would you care as long as you can make that work? And the adults were all running in circles, and the administrators and the teachers, but everybody was trying hard to answer that argument from that child, but they didn't have an answer because they themselves had set up a system without values. And they were horrified by what they'd created. Now, I mean, I know there's exceptions to that, but that is what's going on. So, my friends, Education for Life, we have several pages of it. That's what we'll do next week. God bless you.